Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to have you here, and we're particularly delighted to have Jane and Dr. Willard here with us as well. And I want to tell you a little bit about how all of this came to be. That's my part this morning. It turns out, and I'll start the story back in 1971, when I was a biology major. I thought I'd go on to be a doctor. Wanted to be a pathologist, primarily because pathologists get to help people by sticking them with needles and getting samples, and you don't have to relate to people. I found people very hard to relate to. And so I thought I could be helpful without having to deal with folks right there. Around that point in time, I also had a little crisis in faith. And growing up a missionary kid, I thought, I believed in God, but I wasn't sure if I believed in God because I'd been raised to or because there actually was a God, that sort of thing, So I had set about to find out for myself by going back to the New Testament and just doing what it said there. Because by that point, we'd learned that there's lots of things you're supposed to do because you're a Christian, and I'd tried doing most of them, and I found they were completely dry and unhelpful. And besides that, I'd seen the character of most of the Christians I had met, and I didn't like that all that well either. So I just didn't really know if this stuff worked and if there was a God. But I found in the New Testament, as I read it, three things. One, it seemed to say that you should do nothing out of fear, but rather everything out of love. So, and I found that most of my life was based on fear. I was always afraid of what people were going to say, how they were going to react, whatever was going on. Basically, I was afraid of losing my testimony, upsetting somebody or another. And so life based on fear, that wasn't the right way. The second thing it said was you're supposed to talk to God about everything. And so I decided, okay, I will try to do that. I'll face my fears. I'll talk to God about everything. And the third thing it said was that you're supposed to love people deeply and well. And that was, of course, what I was afraid of. But I decided we'll give this a try. So I was working, I'd hitchhiked across the country looking for work because it was one of those times when the economy was bad. And I ended up in Chicago working at a Salvation Army camp. And one day there was this big lightning storm. I walked out into the room, kind of one of the main rooms there in the camp, and one of the other counselors, a young lady, was curled up in the corner in what I would now recognize as a fetal position, although I had no idea what it was at the time. And she's completely unresponsive, and I thought that wasn't good. And so I said, "Jesus, help," because that's what I was trying to tell. And all of a sudden she opened her eyes and looked around and said, "Where am I and what's going on?" I said, "Well, you're out here. We're having a thunderstorm." "A thunderstorm?" she said. "I've never in my life seen a thunderstorm. They tell me that when I was about 4 months old, lightning hit a tree right outside of my bedroom window where my crib was, completely disintegrated the tree. They came in and found me all curled up in a little ball. And after that, every time in my life that I have been near thunder or heard lightning, you hear one and see the other. Whatever it was, I end up in a ball, and I don't come to again until the storm is over." And it said, well, this was one of those Midwestern thunderstorms, and it was probably the biggest one I'd ever seen in my life. I mean, this thing was glorious. You couldn't go more than a couple of seconds without some huge lightning flash going on. Shook the building. I said, "You haven't seen thunder and lightning? I've never seen one like this before. Come on, let's go look at it." So we sang little choruses and watched the storm, and she asked me, "What happened? Why am I up?" And I said, "I don't know. I just said, 'Jesus, help.' You stood up, and, here we are." Well, I thought that was very curious. So I went back to college then, and I changed my major to a religious studies minor and a psychology major. And I got my degree in both, and I found nothing from the religious studies minor. But I did find from the psychology major that what she had been in was a fetal position, and this was a result of some kind of childhood trauma, and that's how it worked. So they could name the problem, but they couldn't tell me why Jesus helped. So through another series of circumstances that makes another interesting all-morning story, I ended up at Fuller Seminary doing my degree in psychology, getting a PhD and a master's in theology there. And we had all of these courses in which they gave me in much more intricate detail, again, why it was that she ended up curled up on the floor. But no one, even there in my school, could tell me why Jesus' help did anything. There just no explanation for that sort of thing, you see. It didn't fit the scope. We had a couple of courses about spiritual healing, but they didn't explain anything either, not even how to go about it. So I was kind of despairing of all of that when I ended up needing a place to do my internship training, and I got sent to a little place called Shepherd's House out in the valley. At that place, I was supervised by Jane Willard, who was teaching me how to be a good counselor and all that sort of thing. And if I got anything right, it's thanks to her. We just, developed all of these things. But we were doing a good psychology, and we would, of course, pray for people, but that never did anything that we could see. It just, it was part of what you do as a good Christian. Well, this was all going along very fine. I was learning to be the eminent psychologist and to do everything by the book and, not reveal anything of myself and just reflect back to them all of the things you're supposed to do that, make you a great psychologist. But, no relationship with anybody. And then Jane said, well, let's invite Dallas to come over and talk to the conference, to all of the people on staff, and just explain to us about how this fits with Christianity. I thought, well, that was a good idea. It wasn't my decision to invite him because I'm just a lowly intern, but I said this would be interesting to find out. Well, Dallas sat down. I remember the day quite well because I considered it the day that ruined my professional life. He sat down, he said, well, in a style that you'll soon learn to appreciate, although I can't imitate it well, psychology is really the care of the soul. And it was, all throughout history, the providence of the church. And it's only lately that we have stopped caring for souls. And so it's just as well that psychology is doing it because God wants his souls cared for. But he said, the most important thing about the care of souls is that you should love them. Problematic. That's exactly what ruined my career, you see, because the one thing that we had learned is you never get involved with them. You never feel anything about it. You do your clinical stuff very well, but you don't love the people. In fact, that's a good way to get yourself kicked out of the field. But here he is saying, and the problem is, it went back to my original encounter with Jesus, and it said, three things. Don't do anything out of fear, right? Talk to God about everything, and love people deeply. And I couldn't argue with him. I mean, he's just totally, basically, entirely right. This is what people need. They need to be loved and cared for. And the problem is you can't do that and just be disconnected from them somehow or another. It just doesn't work. And so I had to rethink everything I'd been learning, but it brought me that much closer to my original quest, you see. It woke it up. Then one day, Jane walked down the hall. We lived at opposite ends of the hall there. She had the room that was chronically cold, I believe, and so I was putting on sweaters. And I, being the Norwegian, was always just overheated. And I was in the room that was chronically hot. Now, why this works out, I don't know. But so she walked down the hall to me. She said, I don't know if I should tell you this, but at our end of the hall, we are inviting Jesus to come in, and he's healing people. And that is the question that I had by now spent, close to 12 years and tens of thousands of dollars trying to find out about. I was completely fascinated by this. This is what I wanted to know. How does it work? And so in the middle of this, then I went down the hall to find out everything that Jane was doing. These two things became the root of what we're talking about here today. Why is it that having Jesus intimately involved and talking with him about everything changes life and heals people and transforms what's going on? And why is it that we at the same time, need to be involved with loving them and real relationships with them. On the one hand, we have to be growing in maturity. On the other hand, we have to be growing in our connection with God. Well, you see, this bothered people no end when we began to teach about it. From the professional side, it didn't sound that professional because everybody could pray, and we wanted to do professional things, you know. And besides, this whole business about loving people was deeply troublesome. Now, I'm going to stop and make one comment, because I've got an extra couple minutes here to do this with. I read a book some years later called The Nazi Doctors. Now, this is a terrible topic to launch into this morning, but they basically pointed out that all of the death camps of the Nazis were run by medical people, because they found that the military and SS officers, after one day of killing Jews, were so ruined they couldn't ever be used in combat again. It just destroyed them. They couldn't do this sort of stuff. The only people that could keep killing day after day were the doctors, and the doctors that did it best were the psychiatrists. So really they started developing the death camps under the psychiatrists and ran it from there. No offense to my friends, the psychiatrists in the audience. It's actually an offense to me, because they've discovered later, why is it that you could do that? It is that medical training, psychiatric training, counselor training basically teaches you to have a relationship-like demeanor with other people without actually caring about them at all. So here was the basis for how the doctors did what they did. They could say to a person, "Oh my goodness, you've dropped your glasses, please, here, have them again and walk into this gas chamber for me." They appear to have a form of relationship when it wasn't real. It seems that the care of souls is deeply rooted to whether you love them or not. And if you unconnect those two things, you can become the most dangerous of people. So on the other hand, I consider that day with Dallas the day that saved my life, because I was well on my way to becoming just that kind of person. Now, I don't know that I would have ever been under the conditions where you could have found it out, but badly down that particular road where I did not know that the loving, caring for people is the only way in which God wants us to engage with them. Then we find out that when you really need new life, none of us are equipped to give it. So it isn't my love that changes anybody. That's the other thing I had to be disabused of over the years. I thought, well, God wants me to love people. Certainly that must be because I am the lovingest, and that's what's going to make their life better. And that proved to be completely untrue time after time after time. It's God's love that I am simply introducing them to that says, Jesus help, and something way beyond me shows up to make a difference in people's lives. But we are there to care about them enough to walk over and say, Jesus help. Now, the other thing about talking to God is that he has a tendency to answer. And this is the part that became most problematic for us, because Christians didn't accept that well. In fact, they very quickly began to decide that we are heretics of the worst order. And so Jane beseeched Dallas to write a book about whether we can hear God or not. At that point, it was called In Search of Guidance. We always felt the book was written for us. It's now called Hearing God, I believe, and there are many copies of it in the room there in case you don't have a copy of it. But basically, he became the apologist for the fact that even in current life, God is here to talk with us. So not only must we care for other souls, but we must talk with God while we're doing it, or things just don't turn out the way they should. Now, that means there's growth to be had on both sides. And Dallas, after that, went in the direction of developing these spiritual disciplines, exercises to do to help you have an experience with God. And the spiritual disciplines are, by and large, worthless. They are dry exercises that you can do all day long, and if there's no encounter with God, you've gotten nothing out of it. It's the God who is present, and the exercises give you a place in which to encounter God. It's the structure, it's not the exercises that change your life. But the God who is there that you've made room for in those exercises that change your life. And he's developed those and worked with people who say, you know, we really need to be systematic about preparing the space for us to encounter God and encountering him and interacting with certain ways. Meanwhile, Jane has worked just as systematically about how do we encounter people. here's the interesting thing. Jesus showed up in those rooms. He healed people. They were now much better shape than they were, but they were still as immature as ever. They still needed growing up. And for that, they needed the community. They needed the church. They needed people in their lives to engage with them, interact with them, because what happened in a room, even with Jesus, was not all that he had planned. You have to remember that when Adam was meeting with God, talking with God, walking with him every day, God said about him it wasn't good for him to be alone. See, just me and Jesus wasn't enough then. It's not enough now. It's not his plan. I don't know why it isn't, because then I would have had my boyhood wish made true. You know, I could just be me and Jesus, and I don't have to love those people out there, right? Because that's what I'm afraid of. So dealing with these fears, we have had to make exercises also to learn how do we relate to people. But all of this has come out of the life-transforming encounters that I've had with both Jane and Dallas Willard. Now, Dallas is well known for all of his books, and for as prolific a writer and speaker as he is, Jane is equally shy. And the last thing she wants to do is to be up here speaking. So she has basically used us over the years to infiltrate this into the church. But what that does, and the mistakes in infiltrating it are all ours, but what that basically does is it's kept her invisible. And the one thing that I wanted to do today, one of the reasons why we have this happening in California, as well as we have Jane and Dallas here, is I wanted you to know that the roots of anything good you might have seen that involves these two things going together come from the encounters of Jane and Dallas Willard, and how they have in their own life and teachings embodied these two sides of maturity, the spiritual and the emotional. And while they would be the first to tell you, just as we are, that we are learning and experimenting at these things, we haven't done this because we have arrived or achieved or we're the ultimate example of it. We have certainly encountered that God is very active and busy, and when you're in this business of encountering other people and God in a way that interacts with them and is full of love, lets you face your fears and practice the new ways of life with each other, he transforms us into a way that we only can call thriving or alive. And that's why we've called our model the life model. It's how do you be fully alive at all points in your life? It's the abundant life. And now what we wanted Dallas to do for us today was to prove to you that that's important. And so from one of the, I think, more enduring minds in Christendom from our times, I would like to introduce to you Dallas Willard, and he will tell us why these two parts of maturity need to be fit together. So let's welcome him. Yeah.
Thank you, Jim.